If you've got your Pearson Edexcel English Language Paper 1 coming up and you're a little bit stressed or worried about it, then this video is for you. I'm going to walk you through the paper. In the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'll show you what each question requires. I'll point out some common missteps or problems that students often have, and I'll maybe give you some examiner insight through the mark scheme when we go through the questions. Okay, so for the purposes of this video, I've chosen a paper from 2024. It really doesn't matter. It could have been from any paper from the last few years. The format is always the same. One of the first things to say here is that you have 2 hours and 15 minutes for this exam. Now, I would say the 15 minutes is your reading time because, of course, there is an unseen element to this paper. When you come to the source booklet, remember this is the non-fiction and transactional writing exam, you will find an extract from a text that you will have never seen before, and this should be used in conjunction with one of the 10 non-fiction texts that you have seen before. So on this occasion, the text is A Game of Polo with a Headless Goat. Now this is taken from the anthology, so of course you would know those 10 texts hopefully before the exam. I'm not going to be revising those 10 texts with you today. That's not the purpose of this walkthrough video. But you would have 10 non-fiction texts that you need to know before the day of the exam, and only one of these is going to come up. So of course, on the 2024 paper, this was the one that was selected. So the key thing here is to know that one of these will come up. You don't know which, you just need to have learned them all in class and revised them all in your revision schedule, because the lion's share of your time should not be spent analysing that text on the day of the exam. That should be there for your reference as a blank copy, because of course you're not allowed to take your anthologies into the exam. You are allowed a blank copy of whichever the text it is. So this is really just for your reference, just to remind yourself at a glance of what the text was about, not for you to be spending any real time analysing in that 15-minute reading time. The bit that is going to take your time would be the non-fiction text you've never seen before. And on this occasion, it was an extract from a writer called Ben Fogle, who was taking part in the World Tin Bath Championships on the Isle of Man. So with your 15-minute reading time, you would need to be going through that text quite carefully, reading it at least once to make sure you understand the gist of what's being said, and then obviously beginning to analyse it for some language and structural features, which you will end up talking about predominantly in questions 4 and 5. I'll put that aside for the time being, however. Let's go back to the paper. So that's your source booklet. Now, it does say in terms of timings that for section A, which is the reading, you should spend around 1 hour and 30 minutes on this section. And it says for the writing, you should spend about 45 minutes on your question. Now this is where I and it's probably one of the few occasions where I disagree with the suggestions on the instructions. And I tell my students to shave 15 minutes off this section and give it to this section, because what I always find is that students run out of time on the section B, transactional writing. And actually, both sections are worth the same marks, 45 marks for the reading and 45 marks, as you can see, for the writing. So it makes sense to me that you should really apportion about the same amount of time to each section. Obviously, this would need the reading time, so 1 hour and 15, possibly on that. And then that would allow you to have a full hour on that section. And the reason I say that is because very often students can find easier marks on the writing section than they do on the reading, particularly when it comes to question 5, which I'll talk about later. So I don't always do this, and of course, whatever your teachers have told you to do, then make sure you do that. But My advice would be to give yourself an appropriate amount of time on the transactional, given that both sections are worth about the same, well, they are worth the same marks. I would give myself 1 hour for section B. Anyway, back to reading for the time being. So the paper starts reasonably gently with a 2-mark question. So you should have by now read text 1, Tin Bath Tournament, and it asks you to find 2 words or phrases that describe the weather for 2 marks. Now, the key thing here is, and you'll see this again in subsequent questions, it points you towards certain lines. Occasionally there are times when the answer you might put in here is correct, but it's just from the wrong place. So wherever it says the line references, make sure that you are only quoting from that particular point. Now, the other piece of advice I always give my own students is if it's asking for 2 things, I would always try to find 3. And the reason for that is very simple. If you put only 2 things and one of them is wrong, then you've immediately lost 1 mark. If you put more than 1 thing in there, so if you give 3 things and one of them's wrong, then you still could get the 2 marks. If we look at the mark scheme for this particular question, you will see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 possibilities that they would award marks for. But you'd only get a maximum of 2 marks, even if you'd given 3 things and they were all correct. But I would just say, as an insurance policy, if you can point out more than 1 thing, then I would do that. I won't dwell too much on that because it's only worth 2 marks. And on the in terms of how long you would spend on each question, the usual rule of thumb is about 1 minute per mark. So on this kind of question, you shouldn't really be spending more than a couple of minutes. Question 2. Now it says, look again at lines 41 to 51. So again, I would take my extract. I would look for lines 41 to 51. So we are looking at this paragraph here. I would make sure that whatever I say in response to my answer is only taken from this paragraph. And it says, in your own words, describe what happens. Now, this is one of the few occasions where you don't need to use a quotation, because this is a summary writing task. This is a question that's inviting you to read something and then summarize it in your own words. So you don't need to use quotations for this. You just need to write out what you think happens in this particular paragraph in your own words. And that is worth 4 marks, as you can see at the bottom there. Question 3 starts to become a little bit more valuable. We're up to 5 marks now. And again, from lines 67 to 74 on this occasion. So again, I would go back to my extract, lines 64 to 74, which looks about there. And again, I would put a box or some brackets around that to focus my thinking. Explain the writer's thoughts and feelings, and here you may support your points with brief quotations. So here is where you are using quotations, and you are, depending on how you've been taught, you might be using P-paragraphs, petal paragraphs. If you want me to do another video on those kinds of strategies, then drop me a comment below. But you are elaborating on the writer's thoughts and feelings based on some quotations and explaining what those quotations mean for 5 marks. If we go to the mark scheme again, you can see that they've given 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 possibilities for what this might look like. So there is ample opportunity for you to find 5 things about, in this case, Ben Fogle's thoughts and feelings. It might be that you don't particularly phrase one of these in exactly the way the mark scheme suggests, but I think that's important to note. The examiner will reward all valid points So if you are answering the question and you've taken it from that particular paragraph, you should get the mark. So far, so good. So question 4 and 5 is where students potentially start to struggle a little bit. These are the higher tariff questions, and this is now where you are introduced back to the text from the anthology that you should know. So question 4 is only about the 10 non-fiction anthology texts. In this case, A Game of Polo with a Headless Goat, and you are only answering about that one text. When we get to question 5, it's a comparison question. I'll talk about that in a moment. But for question 4, how does the writer Emma Levine use language and structure in text 2 to engage and interest the reader? And again, you are invited to use brief quotations for 12 marks. So this is where you are showing your knowledge and understanding of the text you've spent time in class studying. Again, I can do a video on language structure features. That's not for now, this is just a walkthrough. But this is where you would be talking about, for language, things like similes, metaphors, pathetic fallacy, any ambiguity, imagery, oxymorons, juxtaposition, all those kinds of things for any language features. Structure, you are talking about how the piece was put together. How does it begin? How does it develop? How are we left at the end? Are there any temporal markers? What are the length of the sentences? Are they short? Are they long? What are the length of the paragraphs? Are they short? Are they long? Is that for pace? Are certain points of the story quick? Are certain points in the story slow or giving more detail? So this is one where you do have a heads up because you should have spent time studying that text in class, and you've got a blank copy of the text in your source booklet. So really you don't need to worry about anything other than answering the question about how the writer keeps us interested. How does the writer make us interested in her snapshot of the story in those couple of pages? All the while remembering you are an English language student, so you are talking about how she deliberately manipulates language and structure for certain effects. And that's question 4. Now look at the amount of pages they give you to answer that. There are 3 blank pages, and very often students will write a side and a half. I know that the common adage is quality, not quantity, and in fact some students are very succinct and concise in the way that they write. But if you're given 3 pages to answer a 12-mark question, then really you should be using at least a side and a half to 2 sides of that. If you're only writing a few lines, then perhaps you're not giving enough detail. Question 5 is the one that students struggle with, and maybe I might do a standalone video just on tackling question 5. It is a high tariff question, 22 marks, so you need to be giving yourself around 20 to 25 minutes to answer this question. And it is a comparison question. You are to compare how the writers present ideas in both the texts. So the one that you've never seen before today, the day of the exam, and the one taken from the anthology, which you have studied and hopefully revised in school. Compare the writers present their ideas and perspectives about their experiences. So that's a reasonably open-ended question. Both extracts deal with different experiences. Hopefully, just by reading the unseen once or skimming through twice, you've already picked up on what the unseen experiences are. You already know what hopefully the Game of Polo experiences are. So you should already be able to formulate some similarities and differences between the two. I always say to my students that this question is a game of balancing, kind of, because you have 2 texts to study, and if you look at the mark scheme there, candidates who have only answered on 1 text may only achieve a mark of up to the top of level 2. So out of 22 marks, if you only talk about 1 text, then the maximum you can get is the top of a level 2. You will only ever get up to 8 marks. So you must talk about both texts. And in terms of balancing, you should be talking about both texts equally, really. But of course, we should be striving for better than a level 2. If you look at the mark scheme, I've highlighted a few phrases. Now, you may want to pause the video just so you can get a flavour of the kinds of comparatives on this particular paper, but I've highlighted in blue the both. Both texts do this, so these are your similarities, and the mark scheme has identified countless crossovers where the texts are doing similar sorts of things. The writers have reacted in similar sorts of way. Maybe how both of the writers have set the scene or developed their story in similar kinds of ways. But then as you get towards the latter end of the mark scheme, when the highlights in orange, this is where texts are doing slightly different things. So it's a game of balancing. You've got to talk about each of the texts in equal measures. You've got to try and find an equal amount of similarities and differences between them. Now, very often, as is the case in many English exams, this is not a comprehensive list of everything you could possibly say. There is that statement there, which tends to find its way into many exam papers: reward all valid points. So if an examiner is reading something you have said and it's not featuring in the actual indicative content, but it makes sense and it's a valid point, you will get credit for that. But for 22 marks, and again, if you look at how many blank pages they give you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blank pages. Again, try to write as succinctly as possible, but you really do have to find as many similarities and differences as you possibly can. And in finding those similarities and differences, try to weave in as many linguistic or structural points as well. Students tend to be quite good in talking about similarities or differences in language devices, but they sometimes don't talk enough about similarities or differences in structural features. So for 22 out of 22 here, if you want the very top marks, you are considering a varied and comprehensive range. So you need to be saying lots of different things, as many different things as you possibly can. Analyze writers' ideas and perspectives, including theme, language, and/or structure. And the references are balanced. That's the key word there. If you are talking about one text more heavily than the other, and students tend to do this with the anthology text because that's the one they'll be comfortable with, that's the one they've spent most time on, but then you usher in a quick paragraph towards the end on the unseen, then that's imbalance, and that's showing an examiner that you're really rather unconfident with the text you've not seen. More able students, the students who are getting the level 5s, the higher grades, will be able to show more confidence with the unseen text. To finish with question 5, I would just add, students get quite wrapped up in writing essays for this. In actual fact, if you give a series of bullet points, that often helps your concision. It helps the marker pinpoint what you are saying more quickly, and it cuts out the waffle. I might do a video from an examiner point of view of the different types of candidates that you will inevitably mark, and one that you want to try to avoid being is the waffler, student who will write pages and pages but actually say very little. Concision is key. Get to the point. If you look at how the mark scheme is structured, the mark scheme's in bullet points. I don't think there's any harm in you trying to be as concise in a similar way with the points that you're making. So you've probably then spent about an hour and 15 minutes on that, and you do need to be quite strict with your time. You do need to keep an eye on the clock, because there will be nobody in the exam talking to you about moving on to section B, but you do really need to give yourself time for section B, because I do think you can pick up relatively quick and easy marks if you give yourself enough time and if you do a plan. Now, just to remind you that unlike paper 2, the transactional writing is not imaginative. You are not storytelling here. You're not writing fiction. Transactional writing is to do with kind of real-world texts, real-world application. This is non-fiction stuff. So you'll always be given a choice of two things, and I always say to my students, you are either doing one or the other. They even highlight the words. Either this one or this one. And I'm saying that because, again, as an examiner, I have seen countless students, more than I would care to mention, who've attempted both. And I don't know why you would do that, because you certainly don't have time to do both in any great depth or detail well. Maybe they're trying to be impressing, as I don't know, but you are only doing one. And in this case, on this particular paper, your choice is a magazine. Your magazine is inviting readers to send in a review of a memorable event which they've seen or experienced. Write the review, so that's your text type and that's your form, magazine review. Write a review that you would submit to the magazine. Your review may include a description of the event, your opinion of the event and reasons why it was memorable, and any other points you wish to make. So clearly there's a bit of a link here with the game of polo and the tin bath, because they were both about events that were really rather remarkable or memorable. Now, I said this is non-fiction and it needs to be written as a non-fiction believable piece, but if you want to add in fictional elements to your writing, there is nothing wrong with that, and there is no examiner on the planet who's going to come round and check every single detail you write. As long as it's plausible, as long as it's believable, make sure that you are writing a convincing piece. I would always say to my students, hang your response on something that may have actually happened to you, because if you do that, you're not having to be too creative. You're giving yourself a slightly easier time of things by writing about something that really actually happened, not having to make up every single detail. But obviously, as is the case when you're telling your friends stories, sometimes you might embellish things or make things up, add things in for more interesting effect. I would say with the bullet points where it says your review may include, I would always supplant that with your review should include. They don't put these things in there by accident. They are deliberately there to be used as a checklist for you to make sure you are doing those things. And at the end of every paragraph that you write, I would revisit that list and make sure that you are addressing that. The other stock line on both of these is your response will be marked for the accurate and appropriate use of vocabulary, spelling, punctuation and grammar. So remember, this is an English exam, so as much as they're marking you for content and how interesting your piece is, they are also looking for how correct you are with the technical stuff. Can you spell? Can you use basic punctuation? Are you able to use paragraphs? All the things you've been taught since you started reading and writing, really. This isn't just an exam checking what you've learned since year 10 and 11. This is how well you're able to write and the terminal assessment on how well you've written and been able to learn to read and write since you started in junior school. The other option on this particular paper was number 7. Too much emphasis is perhaps placed on the idea of winning. It can be just as important to take part and try hard. Write the text for a speech. So we've got a speech on this one to be delivered to your peers. So that's your audience, in which you express your views on the statement. Again, there's the indicative list. It should include those things, not may. What winning might mean in different areas of life, the benefits of taking part, and any other points you wish to make. All the while, they are checking your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Another piece of advice I would give with either of these is that there isn't one that's easier than another. Students often ask, well, which one's the easiest to do? There isn't one that's easier than another. It's only your perceptions. If you're not sure which to attempt, do a quick plan for both. If you're a mind mapper or a bullet point lister, 5 minutes spent sketching out some ideas, scribbling on the paper or putting in the exam booklet under the title plan. 5 minutes thinking about each, giving yourself at least 3 or 4 paragraphs you would want to write about. That should help determine which is the best option for you. But examiners don't write these options thinking one will be easier than another. That's not the case. It's just a variety so you can make the best choice. The other thing I would also add is when you are an examiner and you're marking 300-400 of these, you will find that 90 to 95% of students all tend to say the same sort of thing. So if they're answering this one, most students will kind of talk about a memorable event perhaps that happened in school. This one, students will talk about winning races or winning sports events. So my advice in the planning is to try and think about what 95% of students will say and try to come up with something slightly different that sits outside of the common things that students will write about. Typically, the first things that will come to mind in your planning, the knee-jerk things you would write about, will be the 95% stuff, what all of the students will probably write about. If you spend a little bit longer thinking through your plans, the 5% is the interesting stuff. That's the stuff the examiner might catch their eye, the things they don't expect to read about. So try to sit outside of the vast majority of students' response to this. Now, to conclude, the mark scheme for this is in two parts. Many students think that you will just get a mark out of 45 for this. It's not the case. Your piece will be marked probably twice. Once out of 27 for AO4 and once out of 18 for AO5. What does that mean? Well, for AO4, this is the content, this is how interestingly, effectively, imaginatively you're able to write a response to the given task. Are you able to address the intended audience? Does your piece sound convincing? Does it sound like a speech if it's meant to be a speech? Does it read like a magazine or a news article if that's what it's meant to be? If it's a leaflet, does it sound convincing that it's giving good quality advice? So the lion's share of the mark, up to 27 here, is for your ideas and your content generation. Are you perceptive, subtle, sharply focused on purpose and expectations of the reader? And are you being sophisticated in your use of form, tone and register? The mark out of 18 is a little bit more straightforward. That is your spelling, punctuation and grammar. How well are you able to use a range of vocabulary? Have you tried to be ambitious with the types of words that you're using? Are you deliberately modifying sentence structures and paragraphs for deliberate effect? The odd spelling mistake is forgivable. They know you're under exam conditions. They know you're stressed. If it's a complicated or ambitious word you're spelling wrong, you'll still be given credit for trying to be ambitious in your approach. But it's more the more simplistic words if you're making misspellings or errors that they may have issue with. But how well are you able to use punctuation, grammar, manipulating your ideas, structural, grammatical features, and are you punctuating with accuracy? So if you want level 5 up to 18, that's what you need to be doing. Pause the video, have a read. I hope you found that useful. If you have, I would appreciate if you gave me a like. If you've got any questions, then drop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. I do read them all. If you found the style of this video, then maybe check this one out next, because I do a similar walkthrough of the Pearson Edexcel English Language Paper 2. And if you've got the exam coming up soon, then I wish you the very best of luck. See you next time.